Good day. Today is Wednesday, 28th May 2025, and yesterday in my program I said that we were seeing the first signs of panic, real panic, sweep the West as the Russian offensive begins to gather pace, and it becomes increasingly clear that Ukraine's air defenses are no longer coping with the Russian aerial offensive either. And, there's been more reasons to believe that over the course of the last 24 hours or so. Briefly and firstly, there's been utter confusion in Germany as to what exactly it was that Friedrich Merz meant when he spoke yesterday, or the day before yesterday, about the West, the Western powers, having lifted missile restrictions, or range restrictions on weapons supplied by the West to Ukraine. When Merz first said it, the impression given was that Germany was on the brink of supplying Taurus missiles to Ukraine, and that his comment was connected to this in some way. Then we had comments from the Vice-Chancellor, the German Vice-Chancellor, saying that as far as the German government was concerned, as far as the SPD was concerned, there's been no change in German policy whatsoever, implying that the Taurus missiles have not, in fact, been delivered to Ukraine. There's also continued commentary in Germany that, in fact, appears to confirm that the Taurus missiles so far have not been delivered to Ukraine, and that there is no indication at the moment that the Taurus missiles are even being considered for delivery to Ukraine, which then brings us back to the purpose and sense of Friedrich Merz's comment. I mean, what exactly was he implying if for the moment there is no plan and no intention to supply Taurus missiles to Ukraine? Why does he talk about lifting range restrictions, or the Western powers having made decisions to lift range restrictions on weapons supplied to Ukraine, if there is no intention to supply weapons with any particular range, any ability to strike, as Merz said, into the Russian heartland? As I said, it is confusion and uncertainty in Germany. There's been some suggestions in Germany that the intention is to keep everybody guessing, to keep the Russians guessing, to make the Russians uncertain and unsure. I don't think the Russians are in the slightest bit impressed. I don't think it's having the slightest effect on their intentions or on their plans. As we will see shortly, the Russians remain absolutely focused on what they're doing in military terms. There is no sign that anybody in the Kremlin is shaken by these statements from Berlin at all. The only confusion and doubt that all this rhetoric will have created will have been in Kiev and amongst some of Germany's Western allies. Just saying. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has also been speaking. The day before yesterday, he made his famous Truth Social post in which he said that Putin had gone crazy and that his attacks on Ukraine made no sense, even as he simultaneously made comments appearing to be highly critical of President Zelensky of Ukraine. So that was Donald Trump. He's then spoken since. He's talked about the fact that he's now seriously considering further sanctions against Russia, that he feels that Putin is not taking the situation seriously. He's published another True Social post in which he says rather plaintively that Vladimir Putin doesn't seem to understand that if it were not for Donald Trump, really bad things might have happened to Russia by now, implying that the situation might soon arise when those bad things will indeed begin to materialize. Well, I have to say, I thought the last Truth Social post by Trump came across to me as rather weak. It almost had about it a pleading quality, almost begging Putin to slow down. It wasn't, or so it seems to me, really threatening anything very much, whilst at the same time talking vaguely about really bad things that might be just there over the horizon. And if reports are correct about the sanctions that Donald Trump actually is considering and which he might announce at some point this week, then I suspect the Russians will not be fazed by them in any conceivable way, and they will probably also read those sanctions plus Donald Trump's comments as a further admission that the Americans are beginning to realize that they themselves are running out of options, that they cannot control a situation in which the Russians have all the cards. I say that because CNN is now saying that the sanctions that Trump is due to announce are going to be token in character. Apparently, the idea of further banking sanctions has been dropped. I cannot see myself what meaningful additional banking sanctions over and above those which already exist the United States can, in fact, announce. And I suspect that whatever additional sanctions are announced will be similar to the ones of the 17th sanctions package that the EU has just issued, which makes certain further sanctions against the so-called Russian shadow fleet, but which nobody seriously believes is going to change the situation materially, either in terms of the Russian economy or its military production, and which will certainly not change Russian perspectives on the war. Of course, the possibility of Lindsey Graham's massive, bone-crunching sanctions package somehow gaining extra life does exist. But, as I have said already, if it is ever implemented, it would require the United States to reimpose massive sanctions on China, 500% sanctions on China, assuming that the Chinese continue to buy Russian oil and gas and other energy products such as uranium, as I am sure, by the way, they will. And, of course, the United States could also find itself having to sanction its erstwhile ally, India, for doing the same thing. And given the problems that the previous tariffs imposed on China were causing to the US economy, I cannot truly believe that Donald Trump or his officials, Scott Bessent, for example, really want to go there. Lindsey Graham and his sanctions package exist. They're there to, I think, put pressure on Donald Trump more than anything else, to keep him putting a hard line on Putin and on the Russians. But whatever Lindsey Graham himself might think, this sanctions package is not going to scare the Russians or cause them to change their policies. And if it is ever implemented, what it will do is end Donald Trump's ambition to move the United States to a position of 3% annual growth, certainly within the period of his own presidency. And it could also result in a return of inflation, which has been rising in Europe. In Britain, it is now rising significantly. but which it's difficult to imagine with the kind of tariffs that Lindsey Graham is talking about would not cause inflation in the United States also, as well as massive disruption in the global economy. As for Russia and its economic situation, the reports there speak of a significant decline in inflation in April and May. We have not yet been given exact figures, but it seems that inflation did indeed peak in March, that it is now significantly below the 10% level that it reached in March. I've seen some suggestions that suggest that inflation is currently running at about 7%. The central bank is insisting that it will maintain interest rates at their current levels until inflation securely falls to its 4% level sometime during next year. There is, as one might expect, with interest rates currently at 21%, and by the way, if inflation rates are now at 7%, that means real interest rates are around 14%, very high. There is undoubtedly a slowdown in economic growth, but not as great a slowdown as one might expect, given the level of the interest rates, a sign of the very, very high level of momentum that the Russian economy has built up over the last 2 years. So anyway, there we go. Now, the Russians have been responding to all of these various threats from Merz and from Trump. The Russian Foreign Ministry has applied to the UN Security Council for a debate to discuss European attempts to sabotage the negotiations between Russia, the United States, and Ukraine. I wonder what will, if anything, will come of that meeting. Maybe, just possibly, we will start to see divisions begin to appear once more between the Americans and their European allies, though I think that's far from certain. More likely this debate will achieve nothing of any significance. But anyway, it is a marker that the Russians are putting down, that they're not going to be pushed around, and that whatever is coming out of Europe, whatever Merz might be saying about long-range missiles, it isn't going to deter them or intimidate them in any way. As for Donald Trump's statements about something really bad happening unless the Russians are careful, well, Dmitry Medvedev, former president, former prime minister, vice chairman of Russia's Security Council, which I think in practical terms means that he's now Russia's number 2, head of the Military Industrial Commission, as he also is, has actually come out and made a statement. I think it's on Twitter, posted a message on Twitter X, I should say, in which he says that as far as the Russians are concerned, there is only one thing that would be really bad, and that, in fact, is World War III. So the implication is that unless the United States becomes directly involved in the war, in other words, it sends troops and aircraft to Ukraine to directly fight the Russians there, which would be World War III. The Russians would respond. There would be an escalation in fighting. Unless something like that happens, and even that would not be sufficient, that is the implication of Medvedev's words, to cause the Russians to back down. Well, that is the only thing that the Russians would fear. Anything else, they will simply brush aside, and they will continue with the war very much in the way that they're still doing. Now, Putin himself has been speaking. The Kremlin has not yet provided, as of my time of making of this program, a full transcript of his words. But I understand that he's been saying that Russians in general need to mobilize internally. He's not suggesting that there's going to be a new conscription drive or anything like that. There's no need for this because as US intelligence is now also confirming, the Russian army is now recruiting more men than it needs to make up losses. In fact, it's able to build up reserves, and it's producing more missiles than it is using, so it is increasing its stockpiles of missiles, and it is probably increasing its stockpiles of artillery shells, of tanks, of many, many types of equipment as well. Anyway, it's not, Putin said what he meant by mobilization. What I think he was meaning is that the Russians need to be even more united, even more determined to see the war through, which, by the way, mirrors the sense that I got in my brief visit to Russia earlier this week, or rather last week. I don't think that Putin means anything more than that. But anyway, he seems to think that the Russians need to remain united because this is an existential conflict for them. Now, I ought to say that apparently US intelligence has also reported that Putin regards this as a war that is existentially important for Russia and for Russia's future place in the world. In which case, it seems to me, he is even less likely to be deterred from pursuing it, and he's even less likely to be intimidated by sanctions and threats of that kind if he thinks that the war is as important as US intelligence apparently believes. So, as I said, all of these comments from Merz, from Trump, they're not scaring or intimidating or frightening the Russians or causing the Russians to change course. What they are doing instead, and I suspect this is how they are understood and being read in Moscow, what they are signaling instead is increasing alarm in the West at the direction that the war is taking and at the events on the battlefronts and in the air. Now, before I proceed to talk about that, let me just say that about several days ago, Putin gave another interview. I believe it was with Pavel Zarubin. I've been waiting to see whether the Kremlin would provide a readout or whether the Russian media would provide a full account. But I haven't yet seen it. I haven't yet been able to find a full transcript of Putin's words. Anyway, apparently, Putin also discussed the early stages of the war. And seemingly, he confirmed what I think is now largely obvious, which is that the force that Russia sent into Ukraine in February 2022 was completely inadequate to take control of the whole country or to capture Kiev itself. It was intended to prevent Ukraine overrunning Donbass, which is what the Russians in February 2022 were afraid that Ukraine was about to do. And it was also intended to establish the land bridge to Crimea, and by taking positions around Kiev to put pressure on the Ukrainians to negotiate with the Russians and to agree a peace in line with the abortive Istanbul Accords. That, I think, has already been clear, at least to me, for a very long time. However, apparently Putin said something else. And this I have not been able to confirm because I haven't been able to find the exact words. But I did see it reported in this way by TASS itself, which is that Putin apparently said that in February 2022, Russia's military power was insufficiently great for Russia to do anything more. That Russia in February 2022 did not have the resources to conquer the whole of Ukraine, to take Kiev, or at least to take Kiev in a contested battle, or to do any of those things. Since February 2022, Russia has built up its military forces to a far greater level, to the point where perhaps it is capable of achieving all of those things. But that was not the case in February 2022. Now, this, interestingly enough, somewhat corresponds with what some Western officials are saying. It corresponds with what General Cavalry and other officials in the Pentagon have been saying, that the Russian military today is bigger and more powerful than it was in February 2022. And interestingly enough, it is not entirely out of line with what the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has just said. He has been saying that Russia has recovered extremely fast since February 2022, since the losses it incurred at that time. He's overstating those losses, and that Russia will be in a position to take on apparently the whole of Western Europe in 3, 5, or perhaps 7 years. The last part of his comment is, of course, absurd, but Mark Rutte does also appear to be acknowledging that the Russians are indeed building up their military forces at an astonishing rate, one that has the West incredulous with Russian armaments production exceeding that of the entire collective West combined, and the Russian army growing in size and strength every single day. So one can understand the reasons for the panic and alarm and the contradictory and strange statements that we see across the West. Now, not everybody appears to share this panic. General Kellogg has been speaking. He recently posted a message in which he said that it is Sun Tzu tactics to try to weaken the enemy without actually engaging him in battle, which appears to suggest the Russians as the enemy who's been weakened. As we've seen, in reality, the opposite is true. And General Cavalry is also, General Kellogg is now also saying that the United States has this wonderful 22-point plan, that neither the Ukrainians nor the Russians like it, and that means that this is a very good plan and one which apparently there's a good chance that it might eventually be adopted. Well, I suppose the best thing that can be said about that is that it is a point of view, but it is not a point of view that I remotely share. First of all, General Kellogg is again making the mistake of equating the Ukrainians with the Russians. The Ukrainians might not like the 22-point American peace plan, but ultimately the United States has enormous leverage over them. If the Ukrainians don't like it, the United States has means of forcing Ukraine perhaps to accept it. If the Russians don't like it, it is a completely different matter. Because, as I've said already, the United States has no effective leverage over the Russians at all. It has already been supplying Ukraine with weapons for 3 years, and those weapons have not defeated the Russians on the battlefields. And as for sanctions, the United States has already imposed 3 years of sanctions on Russia, and the Russian economy, despite what you sometimes read, has not cracked and is not likely to do so. In fact, further sanctions are more likely to collapse the Western economy, in my opinion, than they are likely to collapse the Russian one. So, again, I think General Kellogg perhaps doesn't fully grasp the realities. I'm not sure that he's ever fully grasped the realities. And frankly, as far as I'm concerned, his 22-point plan is dead in the water. Meanwhile, the Russian offensive continues. And yesterday I devoted a significant amount of time to my program to discussing the drone and missile offensive that the Russians are conducting and contrasting it with the failed drone offensive against Russia that the Ukrainians have been conducted. And I suggested that, in fact, it was partly the failure of that Ukrainian drone offensive, in which a huge amount was invested in terms of hopes and resources in the West, that has perhaps triggered the deepest alarm and the greatest panic of all. Well, Julian Repa of Bild Zeitung, a journalist who, as I said, cannot be faulted in terms of enthusiasm for Ukraine, but who nonetheless, and I give him this credit, is more realistic about the realities of the war than many other Western journalists and reporters. Anyway, he has now come out and he's made the following comment about the war in the air. He says that Russian missiles are getting better and the Ukrainian air defense system is getting worse. I would very much like to offer some solution. I would like to say what can be done. But I don't know what to do if your adversary uses ballistic missiles and has a stable production, both Calibris and many other cruise missiles, and you are running out of air defense missiles. So frankly, I have no idea what to do in this situation. Well, that is honesty and that is truth. And as I say, much as I disagree with Julian Repa about the entire nature of the war, I commend him for saying it. And of course, he's not just talking about Russia's advantage in ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, which is indeed, as he correctly says, growing all the time. He omits to mention Russia's increasingly effective drone warfare, the situation where we might be seeing sometime in the next few weeks or months 500 Geran drones operating over Ukrainian skies every night, with apparently around 300 of these drones being produced, well, every 3 days. Just saying. So, anyway, credit to Julian Repa for saying it as it is. I've heard no further news about big Russian drone and missile strikes across Ukraine over the last 24 hours. That doesn't mean that they haven't taken place. The Russians have responded angrily to Donald Trump's claims that these are senseless attacks. They say that they are retaliatory attacks for the Ukrainian attacks, drone attacks on Russian territory, and that Russia always targets only military targets. Now, the first part of this claim, I believe, is true. The second part of this claim, I believe, is true. I think the Russians do principally attack military targets. In other wars that have involved missile and bombing campaigns, including the current war that is underway in the Middle East, it seems to me that you civilians have suffered far, far worse. And of course, in earlier wars, the war in Vietnam, other wars in the Middle East, going back to the Second World War, the numbers of civilians who've died in missile and bombing strikes on cities have been immeasurably greater than what we're seeing in Ukraine. But the first part of what the Russians are saying, that this is all simply retaliation for what the Ukrainians are doing, I don't myself actually believe. After all, the Russians have been building up this production of drones and this production of missiles for a purpose which presumably is to conduct the kind of aerial drone and missile offensive that we are seeing play out now. Otherwise, as I said, why would they have increased the factory space, devoted the resources, perfected the drones, improved the missiles, and produced them in such vastly greater quantities as they are currently doing? So, as I said, I don't take seriously the first point, though I think the second point is likely true. But even though I don't myself think that the first point is the reason for the Russian drone and missile offensive against Ukraine, the Russians nonetheless are making a valid point. Why criticize, in the way that is being done, the Russian drone and missile attacks across Ukraine and remain silent about the Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian targets inside Russia, some of which do seem to be mostly directed against civilian facilities, including, by the way, places of worship? Why remain silent about those? Why pretend that they are not happening? Or, as is the case with some of the media in Britain, why, when these drone attacks on Russian cities take place, why cheer them on in the way that the British media, for example, are doing? Well, I think reality is, of course, that is completely unsurprising. We know the motivations. But, as I said, the Russians are making a valid point, they're scoring a good point here. And anyway, one way or the other, what all of this means is that the Russians have no intention and no plan of stopping their missile and drone offensive, which is currently underway. Now, to go back to Julian Repa's words and to what we hear from US intelligence, the Russians are producing more missiles and drones than they are using at the moment. So they're stockpiling them. And that suggests that at some point over the next couple of weeks, we're going to see a massive resumption of missile and drone attacks. Mass missile and drone attacks on what precisely? Will we perhaps see the resumption of what John Helmer has called the electricity war? Attacks on Ukrainian energy facilities, maybe in coordination with the Russian ground offensive, which is now underway. Or will we see these missiles and drones, these additional missiles and drones that are being stockpiled, used to support the actual ground offensive that is underway? Or will these missiles and drones be used to try to hunt down the political leadership of Ukraine? Well, one can only guess, and I'm not going to spend more time guessing because I don't know. As I've said many times, the Russian General Staff does not share its plans with me. Now, before I continue and quickly turn to what is actually going on in the war, I just wanted to say that President Putin has, in fact, disclosed some more interesting information about himself, both directly and indirectly. Directly, it seems that he's keeping a diary. He's actually recording information that he's been receiving since the start of the war. So he's keeping a personal record of the war itself. Now, that will be very interesting to read if, or probably when, it is ever published. Memoirs, of course, are written by political leaders. Perhaps the diary is intended to make possible the memoir that Putin is one day intending to write. I hope it is preserved because, as I said, it will be an important record in itself. The second thing that we've learned from the Kremlin is that apparently when Putin has his conversations with Donald Trump, these conversations take place through interpreters. But Putin now speaks and understands English sufficiently well to understand what Trump is saying before the interpreter has translated it into Russian. So Putin, like many Russian officials, like Lavrov, who of course speaks fluent English, always has that advantage over Americans and, by the way, Britons in negotiations. Of course, he has the same advantage when he's talking to Germans as well. He understands what they're actually saying, and he has time whilst the interpreter is interpreting to prepare his reply. By contrast, as I understand it, none of the present crop of Western leaders, certainly none of the Western leaders that hold high political office at the present time, Donald Trump, Keir Starmer, Friedrich Merz, or Emmanuel Macron, or Giorgia Meloni if it comes to that, or Mr. Sanchez in Spain, none of them speak Russian. So anyway, there it is. Two interesting revelations about Putin. And as I said, I hope that one day he will write his memoirs about the war. And when he does, I will find them. I will certainly read them. And I will no doubt find them extremely interesting. Now, several sources have claimed that the big Russian summer offensive began over the course of the last 24 hours. I disagree. I think the Russian offensive began in March. I think that it began directly after the collapse of Ukrainian positions in Kursk. As soon as the offensive in Kursk was out of the way, the Russians started to attack the Ukrainians in various positions across the front lines. Of course, the Russian advance has never entirely stopped since October 2023, when Ukraine's summer offensive failed, or to be more precise, was defeated by the Russians. But there was a significant slowdown in the pace of the Russian advance over the course of the late winter months. But anyway, the Russian offensive resumed in earnest in the second half of March, and ever since then, it has been building momentum, so that we are now starting to see the Russians advancing at an ever quicker rate across the battlefronts. In fact, one Russian commentator, I think it was Andrei Marochko, has said that in some parts of the battlefronts, the Russians are now advancing not just kilometers at a time, but multiples of kilometers at a time. This isn't, of course, true, right across the battlefronts, but it is increasingly true in more and more places. And, well, there's been, as I said earlier, as I said in my previous program, reports of heavy fighting in Yunarkovka, the village, the fortified village that basically shields the city of Sumy from further Russian advances. But there's been a very interesting piece of news from Sumy region, which is coming from Ukrainian sources, which say that the situation in Konstantinovka, in Donbass in other words, has now become so catastrophic that the Ukrainian military command, General Syrski in other words, have been obliged to redeploy 3 brigades from Sumy region to Konstantinovka, which now means that the Ukrainians are desperately short of troops in Sumy region. I am not suggesting that the Ukrainians have given up on the city of Sumy or that the city of Sumy is about to fall. But the Russians, according to some reports, captured 4 settlements in one day in Sumy region, and it could be that we're going to start to see a major expansion of the territory in Sumy region that the Russians control over the next couple of days. The same seems to be true in Kharkiv region as well. There's been reports, well, I've discussed already that there have been reports that the Russians are now in effect in control of the whole of Volchansk, north of the Volga River. In fact, there are some expectations that the Russians might be preparing to announce that tomorrow. We'll see. If there is such an announcement, I expect it will come from Group of Forces North, by the way, not from the Ministry of Defence, which only talks about the capture of cities if the entirety of a particular city has been captured. But it does look as if the greater part of Volchansk, which lies north of the Volga River, has indeed fallen under Russian control, and there are reports that a large forested area that lies to the east of Volchansk has also been overrun by the Russians, with apparently minimal resistance. It does look as if the Russians are preparing to resume their Kharkiv offensive in earnest, with the fall of Volchansk perhaps opening up the way both for the Russians to link up with their forces west and north of the Oskol River, but also perhaps positioning the Russians to capture the village of Lipsy, which is the high ground, represents the high ground relative to the city of Kharkiv, and perhaps, just conceivably, we might see a resumption of the Battle of Kharkiv again, a second Battle of Kharkiv, if you will. The Russians were very close to Kharkiv in 2022. In fact, in February 2022, a Russian reconnaissance force briefly entered Kharkiv that was quickly withdrawn, but it could be the case that this time the Russians will settle down to a siege of Kharkiv in earnest, with Russian artillery positioned in Lipsy, able to shell positions in Kharkiv essentially at will. Anyway, all of this is bad enough, but it really doesn't convey how bad the situation is becoming in other places. Firstly, there are now reports from the Ukrainians themselves that their troops in Liman and Siversk are desperately short of supplies. The troops in Siversk, it seems to me, are under real threat of encirclement, and there's not only confirmation that the Russians have captured the village of Erkamyanska immediately to the east of Siversk, but it seems that they managed to dig in there and are now in a strong position to attack Siversk itself from this village. So it could be that the Battle of Siversk is now about to start in earnest, and it may be that it could fall. When it does, as quickly and as dramatically as, say, Ugledar or Velikaya Novosilka fell when the Russians reached those two previously heavily fortified cities. But even that, as I said, isn't the worst of it. The real catastrophe that is playing out for the Ukrainians is in the area of Konstantinovka. I said that it looked as if the Ukrainian troops south of Konstantinovka were in a double cauldron. In effect, that a force south of Konstantinovka had been effectively encircled, and that the Russians appeared to be about to create another layer of encirclement north of the line that they'd already taken, which had already bottled these Ukrainian troops south of Konstantinovka in. And in fact, it looks as if this advance is continuing. And even as the Ukrainians are rushing troops from Sumy region to reinforce their positions in Konstantinovka, it seems that the Russians are reinforcing in this area as well, and that their advances, if anything, are continuing to accelerate. And with the Battle of Chasiv Yar probably having mostly ended, the town of Chasiv Yar, the central part of Chasiv Yar, it seems has fallen. It seems that the Russians again will be in control of the dominant heights in Taurus and Chasiv Yar. I would remind people that the Financial Times essentially admitted that the Ukrainians had pulled out of Taurus and Chasiv Yar 3 days ago. The Russians will be in control of the dominant heights over Konstantinovka. It seems to me that the situation for the Ukrainians in this area is now becoming absolutely critical. But even more critical is what is happening to the west of Konstantinovka, because the Russians in this area not only appear to have captured the village of Malinivka, which appeared to threaten Ukrainian control over the village of Novoekonomichnye, which the loss of which would interrupt Ukrainian supplies to the garrison in Pokrovsk. But it seems that the Russians are actually advancing northwards from Konstantinovka, from this area west of Konstantinovka, and they're now well to the north of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd and of Novoekonomichnye, just as they are well to the west of Pokrovsk as they continue to advance towards the Dnieper. And in advance of the Russians, their drones go. And apparently Russian drones are now busy attacking Ukrainian supply convoys on the main roads leading from Kramatorsk to Konstantinovka. It looks as if supplies for the Pokrovsk garrison are starting to be interrupted, to break down in multiple places. There's been much less news from Pokrovsk itself recently. When I last discussed the situation in Pokrovsk, it seemed to me that the Russians had probably captured positions in southern Pokrovsk and had taken control of certain villages to the southwest of Pokrovsk, which were basically contiguous with Pokrovsk itself. In other words, which should be better understood as outskirts, suburbs of Pokrovsk. Well, we've heard less news about what the Russians might be doing and whether they're still in these places. My guess is that they are. And my guess is that, as I said, over the next couple of weeks, probably very soon, we're going to see a simultaneous attack on Pokrovsk from multiple directions, with the Ukrainian garrison finding it as difficult to hold on to Pokrovsk as the Ukrainian garrison months ago now. It seems like an age, though in time terms it's not actually so far back. It's difficult for the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk to hold out as it was for, say, the Ukrainian garrison in Selidovo to hold out as well. So, to repeat again, the fall of Pokrovsk, when it happens, and it is a question of when, not if, will deepen massively the Ukrainian crisis in Donbass. Konstantinovka, the position of the Ukrainian forces there is looking increasingly precarious. We're likely to see a big push in the north, in Sumy region, in Kharkiv. It looks as if Volchansk has fallen, and there continues to be chatter of further Russian advances in Zaporozhye region. There are reports that the important village of Malaya Tokmachka, just north of Rabotino, by the way, in Zaporozhye region, is now under attack. If it is captured, the next target of the Russians in this area will be the small town of Orekhov, which is the launch pad of Ukraine's 2023 offensive. If Orekhov is captured, the way is open for an attack on Zaporozhye itself. So one could get the sense of how all of the pieces are starting to move, and this before the big Russian armies, the two reserve armies that are lying in wait, are committed fully to the battle. Now, the Russians have essentially rejected ideas of resuming the negotiations in the Vatican. They made it, I think, fairly clear that their preference is for the negotiations to continue to be held in Istanbul. The Americans are now talking about Geneva, but I suspect the Russians will completely reject the suggestion of holding the negotiations in Geneva. As far as the Russians are concerned, Switzerland has forfeited its rights to be considered a neutral country. It has supported Western sanctions. It has been far less friendly to Russia than, say, Turkey has been. So I think that the Russians will insist on Istanbul. The General Kellogg says that the Ukrainians have provided the Americans with their response to the Russian proposals, the agreed document that the Ukrainians and the Russians were supposed to provide. The Russians and the Ukrainians were each supposed to provide to the other side their ideas about how to end the war. The Ukrainians, interestingly, have provided their draft to the Americans, not, so far as I know, to the Russians. I suspect that the Ukrainian draft is essentially a demand for a 30-day ceasefire and nothing more. We hear that the Russian draft is still in preparation. We will see what happens when the Russian draft, which I suspect will be a much, much longer and far more worked out document than the Ukrainian draft will be. We will see what happens when the Russian draft is presented. My prediction, to repeat again, is that the Ukrainians will reject it outright and will say at that point that the negotiations have failed and will demand that the Americans and the Europeans move forward with Lindsey Graham's bone-crunching sanctions. It could be that at that point, Donald Trump finally acts on his threat, the threat he has made endlessly, to walk away from the negotiations. Whether he would at that point give the green light to Lindsey Graham to move forward with his bone-crunching sanctions is a completely different matter. At the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I were privileged to do a programme with Robert Barnes, the US attorney, who's also got many friends in Washington, and who at various times has actually met and knows Donald Trump himself. Anyway, according to Robert Barnes, Donald Trump does actually want to walk away from this conflict, though Robert Barnes is very clear that this is not something that Donald Trump has told you himself. It is Robert Barnes' own assessment of Trump's thinking. Well, it could be, once the Russian memorandum is presented and the Ukrainians reject it, and once the Russians also reject the Ukrainian paper, which, as I said, is likely to be thin and inadequate, it could be that at that point Donald Trump says enough's enough. I've given enough time to this. I'm going to sign off on some sanctions. I'm not going to go with Lindsey Graham's boneheaded sanctions. Boneheaded rather than bone-crunching, just to say. I'm not going to go ahead with those sanctions. They would be counterproductive to the United States itself. A curse on both their houses. Putin is crazy. Zelensky is, well, he can't keep his mouth shut. He's wrong about everything. Just let these two people work it out between them. If they can't take advantage of my good offices to negotiate a compromise, well, it's their fault and it's not mine. Well, we shall see. But one way or the other, we are closer now, I think, than we have ever been to a military outcome to this war. Probably sooner than many people imagine, just saying. And for what it's worth, I think that the negotiation process is now practically at an end. Well, there it is. That's my programme for today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.